Breakfast is still lingering in our bellies. Good morning, everyone. UNU-WIDER has been gracious enough to tell me that I'm kickstarting this event and I don't need to wait for one of them to start it. So thank you, Patricia, for putting me on the spot like that. But I hope everyone had a good morning, is having a good morning. And thank you all so much for being here for our first session of the day. No pressure, Nazir. I would like to start this a bit differently, because obviously we had a first day yesterday. And to show how important this is, I will walk down a little bit and pick two people. First one, the question is, what was your biggest takeaway from all the important presentations, parallel sessions that happened? One very quick takeaway from yesterday of all the stuff that you attended.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Chine ABC. My takeaway from yesterday is the concept of leaving no one behind. Social protection is a basic human right. And if we want to ensure that we reduce poverty and ensure an inclusive economic growth, then we must leave no one behind and consider it as a basic human right. Thank you very much.
UNU-WIDER, please put her on a panel next year. She's got a lot to say on this topic. And my last one, please.
Blessed morning, everyone. I am Omuhiringabire Grace, or Ukwezi, as I like to be called. I'm from Rwanda. My takeaway from yesterday is that we aren't ready for any shocks. And so we are falling behind. We need to remodel and re-strategize how we think about social protection and safeguarding for everyone.
A big hand for those that I've just chosen. So today's panel speaks on financing social protection in a reformed international financial architecture. My name is Nazir Pando and I'll be moderating this session. And I'm joined by an amazing panel. I'm generally quite a physically big guy, but this is the first panel I'm telling you I feel very small. Because the people who are with me here are quite esteemed. And I'm glad that they're with us here today. So very quickly, I just want to give a brief background on why we're here. The international financial architecture, I think we all know what that is, severely needs reformation, severely lags behind in global south needs. It doesn't take into consideration very critical things that we're going through as a globe, but especially global south nations: climate change, high interest payments, debt distress. These are things that the IFA needs to now reconsider for global south nations to be able to maximize gaining investment for critical issues. And here we are with social protection being one of those critical issues. Sustainable and equitable social protection requires sustainable and equitable financing. It's a very, very clear sentence and a very clear message. As countries grapple with constrained fiscal space, rising debt burdens, and the need for green and digital transitions, the question is how the international financial architecture can support the funding of welfare systems is more urgent than ever. This panel here in front of you explores the intersection of domestic and international financing strategies for social protection, asking what reforms to the IFA are needed to sustainably support national efforts to expand social spending. So the way the session will go is that I will ask a question to each panelist, and as they answer the question, they'll be able to give an overview on the topic and then get into answering the question. Then after that, we'll get to the Q&A for everybody else. Brief biographies of the people here in front of me. To my immediate right, Professor Annette Ogotu, Professor of Taxation, and the Director of African Tax Institute at the University of Pretoria. She holds a doctorate in tax law and specializes in international tax law. She has authored books, contributed several book chapters, and published numerous articles. She has served as a member of the UN FACTI panel, South Africa's Davis Tax Committee, and the Commissioner of South Africa's Law Reform Commission. Next to her, Professor Justin Lin, Taiwanese-born Chinese economist and professor of economics at Peking University, served as the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 2008 to 2012. He's been appointed as China's State Counselor since September 2013 and is current member of the WIDER board. Dr. Amelia Paulino, Chief of the Investment Research Section at UNCTAD's Division of Investment and Enterprise. She has held senior positions at UNU-WIDER and the University of Sussex and the Central Bank of the Dominican Republic. Her research focuses on trade, investment, and development, and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Kent and has published widely in leading academic journals and volumes. Professor Arkebe, British Academy Global Professor at SOAS, University of London, and former Senior Minister and Special Advisor to Ethiopia's Prime Minister. With over 30 years in public service, he has played a central role in Ethiopia's economic transformation. As Mayor of Addis Ababa and Federal Minister, he led bold reforms, championing industrial development and pioneered economic policies replicated across Africa. And lastly, but certainly not the least, Ms. Lucky Star Miandazi is the Tax and Domestic Revenue Mobilization Advisor at the African Union Commission. Formerly with UNDP, she led initiatives linking taxation to the SDGs in Africa. An expert in international tax policy, political economy, and advocacy, she has published extensively on global tax reform. Her work promotes inclusive, sustainable solutions, amplifying African voices, and holds a Master of Science at the University of Oxford. A big hand for the panelists, please. So, my first question then goes to Professor Arkebe. As a policy expert, what reforms to the IFA are needed to make social protection fiscally feasible and resilient? And how can developing countries ensure it can adequately shield from external shocks and expand their fiscal spaces?
Thank you very much. I would like to look at this issue from the perspective which was also discussed yesterday by some of the speakers, most notably by Deepak Nair. And my perspective on this particular issue is social protection or funding welfare cannot be separated from growth dynamics. And also, while the international financial architecture is so important, but that solution and reform can only be a supplementary to domestic resource mobilization. This is the central theme I would like to focus. The issue at hand is we are talking about 7 billion people who need social protection funding for welfare. And these are over 160 countries in the global south. So this raises a lot of issues. Where does the money come? And what does the expenditure, where should the expenditure be directed? How can we make it a catalyst rather than merely only cost component or expenditure? So in particular, from an African perspective, as an African policymaker, I want to provide some evidence on the continent. We have seen in the last 5 years has given us serious lessons. We have seen Ukraine crisis. We have seen the COVID crisis, both the global pandemic and economic recession linked with COVID. We have seen the new Trump tariff war, and all tell us one critical element. We have seen many countries being quite vulnerable, and their growth dynamics has decreased, and they are not able to absorb or to be resilient in response to this crisis. In 2025, beginning of 2025, Africa has 1.1 trillion public external lending. 1.1 trillion. By year 2000, Africa has below 300 billion external public lending. So the growth is quite significant. But a very interesting striking point is nothing has changed between 2000 and 2025. If we look from debt to GDP ratio, now it's 66%, and in year 2000 it was 65%. But what has changed significantly is the structure of the external public lending. In the year 2000, the concessional loans, combining both bilateral and multilateral, accounted for over 80%. Now in 2025 early, private external lending has reached 55%, and concessional loans has shrunk a lot. So African countries have difficulty to pay high interest rate at commercial rate, no flexibility. They have been advised to use innovative financing mechanism, and this has now become a major trap that has also brought IMF to support some countries. So the key issue here is this a virtuous cycle, or is it going to be a solution? And the impact of these loans, if we look at the external public spending, has been now many countries have to account only to servicing the debt about a third of their foreign exchange earnings, and from 30 to 70% of their revenue, and also nearly 5% of GDP goes to servicing. So my argument is this is not a sustainable way for growth. And we have to bear in mind, given the population growth, the dynamics that's going to happen in the coming 2 to 3 decades. But this is not the only way, the only path we have to follow. There is alternative path, a growth path that can be a solution, a virtuous cycle that can put us in a better position. Here, a key point would be on mobilizing domestic resources. On domestic resources, I want to highlight first, most of us talk about tax to GDP ratio. But to my understanding, tax level and GDP ratio does not have any miraculous impact. There may be, and there are many African countries whose tax ratio to GDP is 25%, but we don't see any capital formation. We don't see new jobs created. We also see some countries, resource poor, with 14 to 15% debt to GDP ratio, where they are also spending over 30% in capital formation in investment. So a key point that should concern us should not be the tax to GDP ratio. The key point should be what is the tax structure, who is being taxed, and also what are the key drivers of this taxation, and where is it being spent? Is it being spent in recurrent budget? Is it being spent on growth drivers? Is it being spent on proper programs is a central issue. A second element is there must be a policy government strategy to encourage savings and capital formation, and also the way to channelize finance or resources for supporting development. I'm not saying supporting social protection. I'm saying to those activities that are critical element of development and that will also put the country to respond to shocks. For shocks, the best way is to prepare through alternative mechanisms. It could be sovereign wealth, it could be other alternatives to get ready for what is going to happen. So this element needs to be considered, but this is not going to have an impact because in the presence of inflation and foreign exchange crisis, this is not going to happen. So there is a need that the macroeconomic policy level, as Deepak yesterday highlighted, to implement policies that will help us to tame inflation, that will help us to promote exports, that will also help us to ensure that the value of, the export earnings is not going to be a huge challenge in terms of balance of payment. Without this, the social protection will be in danger, even growth will not be sustained. Again, here from the international financial architecture perspective, there is absolutely a need for debt cancellation and debt restructuring. We cannot think about moving out of this vicious circle without addressing the response to debt cancellation and restructuring.
And if you could
finally,
I
just want to conclude. When we talk about growth and production, we have to look at activities that will help us to create employment. Employment for the youth, employment for the women, employment also for those who are graduating from universities and high schools. And the second point we need to consider is to introduce policies that will help us to promote productive investment, be it foreign direct investment, domestic investment, and also supporting small and medium enterprises. In Africa, we have 50 million formal enterprises without much support, and these are the vehicle also to generate employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And you mentioned, let's keep the lines of tax. Professor Annette, from a global perspective, how can International Tax Corporation and DRM work together to expand fiscal space for countries in the global south, especially those that are in dire need of this reformation of the IFA? And if you could please, let's concentrate now on the global end of things.
Thank you so much. Much appreciation to UN-WIDER for the invitation to be here. As we discussed very well yesterday, we emphasized the fact that all countries need finances to find social protection. Now, over the years, countries in the global south that have overtly depended on foreign aid for funding their social protection have come to realize that due to the dwindling funding and the conditional nature of it, that they need to ensure sustainable funding of their economies by through domestic resource or revenue mobilization. And this is largely financed through mobilizing resources from the public sector, and that is through taxation, which plays a fundamental role in achieving at least 10 of the 17 SDGs, as was discussed yesterday. Now, states are sovereign jurisdictions, and tax is levied at domestic level. Countries are free to set their own tax policies, and no country is under obligation to collect taxes on behalf of another country unless a treaty to that effect has been reached. So historically, countries' tax laws have essentially been domestic in nature, focusing on taxing their own residents with a few provisions that deal with taxing foreign nationals that are trading within their jurisdiction. This changed over the years with the rise of globalization that led to the Industrial Revolution in the global north and the whole colonization that came through it. So with that in mind and the intersection of countries' domestic provisions, this led to countries considering how they can come up with international tax cooperation measures in order to ensure that there is some kind of control in how they tax a foreign investment. And the first measures in that regard were taken by the League of Nations after the First World War, which came up with the first draft model tax convention, and this was to address issues relating to allocation of taxing rights and prevention of double tax treaties. At that time, few countries in the global south were involved in drafting that model tax convention, and it was just a few countries, the likes of Mexico, that were involved in the Mexico draft of the League of Nations model tax convention. When the League of Nations was dissolved in 1945 after Second World War, work on developing the model tax convention was moved to the Organization for European Economic Organization, which later became the OECD in 1961, and it finalized the model tax convention. But the focus of the OECD model tax convention was for developed capital exporting countries, and so it did not defavor developing countries which are in the global south. And so then in the 1980s, the UN comes up with its own model that is fairly in favor of developed countries, although pegged also on the UN model. So over the years, countries have been concerned about, in the global south, about the unfair allocation of taxing rights, even when the UN model came up. And with those concerns, there were also concerns about tax transparency, because global south countries were like, the UN model and both the OECD model are not that very focused on ensuring tax transparency, especially when it comes to multinationals. And the UN Economic Council back in the 1970s was the first to come up with international standards on accounting and reporting within the UN Center of Transnational Cooperation to ensure that multinationals actually are transparent about their tax affairs in their global investments. But these measures were shut down by the business community and by the OECD back in the 1970s. And then in 1998, we see the OECD now coming up with measures of international tax transparency when it issued its 1998 report on harmful tax competition, focusing on tax havens and preferential tax regimes, which it claimed distort financial and investment flows, and called on countries to work together to ensure international cooperation through exchange of information in tax matters. This evolved in 2002 with the OECD setting up the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information. It has a peer review, and then this built up again in 2014 when the OECD called on countries to adopt the Common Reporting Standards on Automatic Exchange of Financial Account Information, still with a peer review framework. Unfortunately, even up to now, few global south countries have benefited from these types of frameworks because the rules have been developed, or the standards of reporting have been developed from developed countries' perspective, which makes a capacity-constrained global south countries finding challenges in responding to these matters. Over the years, global south countries have been concerned about multinationals not paying their fair share of taxes in the countries they invest in, and that is mainly the global south countries that are base countries. But global north countries knew about these issues and they were benefiting from the same. until the global financial crisis hit, and they are put in the position of source countries. And then the G20 got the political will to come up with issues to address base erosion and profit shifting. 2015 comes, and then they come up with the 15 action measures to address BEPS. Unfortunately, many of the global south countries, we are not in position, we are not involved in setting the agenda for the BEPS action measures. And so at the end of the 15 action measures in 2016, they called for a more inclusive framework, and the OECD set up the BEPS inclusive framework to ensure the minimum standards of the BEPS measures are actually implemented in countries. The inclusive framework is apparently supposed to be on an equal footing, but that has been concerned. Is it actually on an equal footing for global south countries? The outcome of the inclusive framework also resulted in countries coming up with a political agreement on the two-pillar solution to tax the digital economy, because this is also a concern for countries from the global south. Pillar 1 deals with a new nexus to tax the digital economy, which is currently on ice because of political stalemate in the US. And then the Pillar 2, which deals with the global minimum tax of 15%, and a number of actually global south countries are beginning to enact legislation on that. And it helps to put a floor to tax competition and the race to the bottom. Hopefully, this will help developing countries address issues relating to tax incentives that are essentially a giveaway of their revenues. On the back of that, we also see global developments on relating to high net worth individuals. This is actually also an issue in developing countries. We do have quite a few high net worth individuals in developing countries. And in 2024, at the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, Brazil proposed a minimum tax on high net worth individuals at 2%, with increased concerns about illegitimacy and lack of inclusivity in the international tax framework. In 2022, the UN passed a resolution for promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation at the UN in order to deal with various matters, including tax evasion, avoidance, BEPS, illicit financial flows, and so forth. And as I come to an end, we have a resolution passed on the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation with protocols that will address issues, hopefully, that are for concern of global south countries. As it is right now, it is yet to be seen whether global south countries will benefit from this new framework convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And I think that was an absolutely exceptional lesson in how we've come from in the past, which is a very important issue, to where we are today. So, Ms. Miandazi, let's now focus on the African context. How can they, after reviewing where we've come from to where we are today from a global perspective, now when we focus on the African continent and the African focus light, where are we, and how can we marry the two, international tax cooperation and DRM, to make space, fiscal space, for issues around like social protection, for example?
Thank you so much, and thank you to UNU-WIDER for having the African Union present here today. So thanks to Professor Aneta, my job is easier now because she gave us a historical context. So I'll focus on the now, where we're at. So the context of this topic has been shaped, but for the African continent, we've had of so many figures. So I will mention one that is a very common figure, which is the amount that is lost to illicit financial flows, the 88.6 billion annually, which was a figure from UNCTAD. But this figure is not just a statistic. The figures that about 20 African countries or more are in debt distress or at risk of debt distress is not just a statistic. It represents schools that should have been built. It represents healthcare workers that have not been hired. It represents social protection programs that have not materialized because this money is being lost. So I just want to start by making it clear that Africa is not a poor continent. We are just being impoverished. So given that, I will go to my comfort area, which is taxation. So taxation stems, as Professor has said, it's usually seen as a national prerogative. But given that now we have to link it to international taxation because of what we've discovered, in a globalized, multilateral world, we cannot do without each other. Digitalization has proved that. Artificial intelligence has shown us that. So for the African continent, with this realization of 55 African member states of the Africa Union, that we have to collaborate, we have to come up with common African position in order to have a voice when it comes to international taxation, when it comes to our bargaining power at the international level or arena, when it comes to the United Nations, when it comes to the G20, and we're very happy as the African Union to now have a permanent seat with the G20. But what are we doing with this seat? This is something that has been given to us by member states, the mandate to represent them, the mandate to represent their interests. So what we do at the Africa Union when it comes to the great issue of the UN Framework Convention on International Tax, as Professor Annette has said, the rules were not made with us in mind, meaning the African continent, meaning African interests. So what we saw is that there is a gap, and we need to push it to where we can actually have a voice, where we can speak, where we can be considered as countries having a voice and contributing to these matters, both technically and diplomatically in the negotiation, to come up with a document that can actually benefit developing countries more, to help us curb cross-border taxation, to help us with dispute resolution issues, to help us with illicit financial flows, to help us with taxation of the wealthy. And we tabled through the Africa Group at the United Nations via Nigeria, which was the first country to actually bring this issue up of coming up with a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. This was something that was never considered before. At the continental level, with our discussions with our New York counterparts, the representative, we came up with a resolution, which is to come up with this UN Framework Convention. And what does that mean? That means a convention that has been tabled at the UN, that we will discuss taxation issues that are of a global nature, that will handle, like I said, issues such as cross-border taxation, dispute resolution in taxation, redistribution of tax, a fair platform where every country has the right to speak and has the right to vote. The negotiations have started. They are meant to continue until 2027, where we have the negotiating group. And within this negotiating group, which is being shared by an African country, Morocco, and we're very proud of that, it's a more inclusive platform. We're discussing double tax agreements, for example, that are now of a multilateral nature. What do they mean for African countries? We're discussing tax transparency, which also on the continent, we're doing something about it, training our countries on why transparency matters, Africa Beneficial Ownership Transparency Network, which we have formed in collaboration with the African Development Bank and other partners, open ownership, just to encourage countries to sign on to this. We are collaborating on training countries on base erosion and profit shifting, together with the Africa Tax Administration Forum. And we're conducting this regionally. Africa is such a big continent, so we're doing it in all the regions. We have 8 regions in Africa, so visiting all the regions and doing capacity building sessions. On Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, also what should be the reaction to African countries on this. So it's always not to play defense, but sometimes it's good to also play offense, which we are trying to do, because the world is moving and it's not waiting for us, and also it needs to be led by us. So we are trying to be part of the rulemaking process. On taxation of the wealthy, I think this is something that was quite a success for us at the Africa Union, because we collaborated very much with Latin America, PT-LAC, on this, and on deciding on the big question that we had from the Africa Union, which was the redistributive nature of what was suggested by Professor Zuckman on the taxation, the 2% on the wealthy. How will it be redistributed to developing countries? And we continue to work with the Latin American countries quite closely on this. And then I will talk about the UN Framework Convention and what we want to see. This is not just something that is to be glorified as, oh, it was pushed for by Africa, but something that will have a great impact on our rulemaking process on international tax for the future. Other things I want to mention is something we call the Africa Financing Stability Mechanism. This stems from the discussion that we had yesterday about what the continent does in terms of dealing with our shocks. And of course, COVID-19 conflict and has taught us that we need to focus more internally on how we finance ourselves. So recently, this has been approved just last year by our ministers, together with the Africa Development Bank that has produced it, which is to help us as a cushion against external shocks. And it will help us raise up to $2 billion in debt servicing by 2025. And then last but not least is what we call the African financial institutions. These are in our founding documents of the African Union, and we're working towards establishing them, which include the Africa Central Bank, the Africa Monetary Fund, and the Africa Investment Bank, which will help us eventually with financial autonomy as a continent. So, in conclusion, I want to say something about expanding the space for social protection. We need a new social contract. I think this is the nature of tax. We pay and then we expect from our governments. But this new social contract needs to be built on the basis of international tax rules that are robust, domestic resource mobilization, the reform of an international financial architecture that puts development first. And I was happy His Excellency right next to me really highlighted this. I live in his country, so I think I'm allowed to say that. And then it needs to put the needs of developing countries first. I heard yesterday someone saying that the population, talking about the population of India, and in the next few years, Africa, the youth in Africa are going to almost double. And we're going to have such a high population of the world coming from Africa. So we need to play a greater role. And we need to ensure that the tax losses that we have from illicit financial flows, tax avoidance and evasion are redirected into development and into financing social goods and services. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lucky Star. Now let's get to another topic. As an investment expert, Dr. Amelia, let's talk about climate change. So we know climate adaptation is key to building resilience, especially in global south nations who are faced with the harsh effects of climate change, right? So now, how can we utilize climate finance to be able to support some of these nations, but without getting into more debt distress and to actually, enhance their resource mobilization? But let's concentrate on the climate finance and other investment opportunities that the Global South can focus on.
Many thanks, and I would like to thank WIDER and the director, Professor Kunal Sen, for having me. This is a true homecoming. I was here for 6 years, and my last project was on fragile states, fragile groups. And 15 years later, I find myself crunching numbers and telling senior UN officials that 30 developing countries up to date have not received a single utility-size project on sustainable infrastructure. More than half of them are small island developing states. So what does investment has to do with this? A lot. Investment has to do with this a lot, because investment happens through a very complex mechanism. Not all investment is direct balance of payment transfer of resources. Many of the investment to social infrastructure and to physical infrastructure happens through international project finance mechanism that involves the private sector, governments, multilateral development banks. And this will take me later to the issue of the reform of MDBs. UNCTAD is mandated by General Assembly resolution since 2019 to report on the investment gaps and investment needs for the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, we are off track to meet the SDGs. We have estimated in 2015, on the eve of the launch of the SDGs agenda, that the gap was 2.5 trillion. As of today, the gap has increased to over 4 trillion, and these numbers are in line to the IMF estimations. Half of these relate to the energy transition needs, and this brings us to social contract and social justice. 80% of private investment goes to mitigation, because that's where the private sector has a clear revenue model and where they can see they have a high return. Only 20% goes to adaptation, which touches on climate justice and on social justice. So these are a lot of numbers that I'm quoting, but when we talk about policies, this matters. And when we talk about the reform of international financial architecture, it also matters. I was part of the team of UNCTAD, which led the Trade and Investment Day last year at COP29. We did a lot of work towards the new quantitative goal for climate, and there was big fanfare that the 100 billion target of the Paris Agreement was reached. But bad news for the Global South is that most of this was achieved through non-concessional loans, not direct investment or direct contribution. When it comes to aid, it also was achieved through, as I said, additionality, not mostly repackaging. So there are issues of transparencies and what is the real investment package and development finance for development package for developing countries when it comes to climate. So there are many issues around investment that we really need to bring to the forefront. Many of them are coming to financing for development in Seville. I think we reach the minimum common denominator when it comes to these issues, because again, we tend to see investment as a setting of a factory, but it's more complex than like that. In terms of climate, again, we are doing some analysis now, and we see that 2% of all the finance goes to the renewable energy. But only 5% of that investment has any sort of guarantee, any sort of risk mitigation mechanism for the developing countries. So again, this brings another layer of complication when you enter a contract, and I see a very senior Latin American and former government official in front of me. We talk about public-private partnerships, which has a very bad name in the region, but this is the way through which many developing countries enter into financing contracts for sustainable development. And when you have that only 5% of these projects have any sort of political or any risk guarantee, it brings the development partner in a very unequal footing and unequal negotiation process. And this brings me to the role of MDBs, the role of multilateral development banks. 2 years ago, when we did the report on investment in the energy transition, we found that if you set up a proper partnership scheme whereby the private sector comes, of course the private sector wants to see the fundamentals, what are the economic conditions in the country, the political and so on, and the natural resources available. But we don't want this to be a contract of resource seeking only, we want it to be of benefit for development and benefit to mobilize resources for social protection. So we found that if the partnership is done properly, that is with the right stake of the government, the private sector, and the participation of a regional and multilateral development bank, the cost of capital can come down up to 40%. That is the spread of debt. So this is a significant number, and this is only for renewable energy. If you take sustainable infrastructure, it's even more so. So I want to, just close my space now, and I'm happy to come back to the discussion, is that investment does have a place because aid cannot take the burden of the SDG agenda alone. We are 5 years to the 2030 development agenda. The private sector plays a role, but we still have countries that are seen as highly risk. There is a monopoly in the valuation of countries when it comes to the macroeconomic conditions. For example, last year we did a paper where we show that more than 20 countries in Africa are not credit rated. They are not credit rated, and this has implications on how they receive funding from capital markets and how expensive the debt is for those countries. And those countries are the same that are paying more in debt services than on health and education. So the monopoly of the credit rating agencies is an issue that might seem too micro, but is core to the discussion of debt sustainability. And we know that Africa is advancing its own credit agency rating mechanism, which can help. But these issues increase the cost of capital as well. So it's not only fundamentals, it's also how the general setup for financing is working. And finally, the link to the G20. There is and I will not take much time of this because Professor Lee will discuss this issue, but only 4 countries in Africa have taken the opportunity or have signed up to the common framework for debt restructuring mechanism. And a key issue still remains coordination among the members of the Paris Club and coordination within the G20 itself. But all in all, when it comes to discussing investment, what we find is that we need to rethink partnerships. They are old, PPPs are old, but believe it or not, it's the main way through which big investment is coming to developing countries beyond special economic zones. And as long as there is a credit rating monopoly, as long as countries cannot access affordable finance, and as long the aid envelope is more about reshuffling than additionality, it becomes a problem. I will stop here. I'm happy to come back to some of the issues.
Absolutely great. Thank you so much, Dr. Amelia. And then Professor Lin, you can take us home now, especially Dr. Amelia mentioned MDBs, the multilateral development banks. But also let's talk about regional multilateral development banks. How can we reform them? How can we enhance them? How can we change them to better support welfare expansion?
Very good. A lot have been said, and the time is short. So I only want to make 3 points. The first one, there's a huge financing gap in the international financial institution to support social protection programs in the global south. The second point, because of the financing gap, it's important to reprioritize social protection programs in the developing world. And the third one, to make this happen, the most important reform of international financial institutions is the reform of development ideas. The first one, UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in the year of 2015. And we all know there are 17 goals. And many of those goals related to social protection. For example, Goal 1, no poverty. Goal 2, zero hunger. Goal 3, good health. They are in the areas of social protections. Now 10 years have passed. This year, 2025. Look back. Most countries have lagged behind of the progress to achieve this SDG by the time of 2030s. And there are many reasons for that. COVID-19, protectionism, deglobalization, and recently, the Russian-Ukraine war. They all diverse the funding for supporting these SDGs. Because of that, when India took up the presidency of G20 in 2023, the Indian government organized an international expert group to work on an issue about supply sufficient funding for the multilateral development institution to deliver its mission. And I'm lucky to be a member of that international expert group. And we call for triple funding, triple lending of this international financial institutions. If we want to reach the target of SDG by 2030, and we want to reach the target of climate change by the time, at the end of this century, we need to make the lending in the international financial institution to be tripled. But if you look into the fact, not only the funding did not triple, the funding did not increase, the funding actually declined. So from this fact, there's a huge financing gap for the global financial institution to deliver its targets. But funding has a gap, it's a reality. But we need to provide the social protection, it's a need. Under this kind of situation, certainly, we need to look into what are the social protection programs. And we need to reprioritize which one we should do first, which one we should do to give more weight. And for this, I'm so delighted that Professor Deepak Nair already discussed that. Traditionally, we talk about social protection. We are talking about some kind of short-term emergent relief. When people are hungry, we support them. When people are sick, we support them, and so on. But more importantly, we should make the people have the ability to protect themselves. And the most important thing is job. If people have job with decent income, there will be no poverty. There will be no hunger. If they are facing health issue, they can go to doctors. There will be good health. And a job also need to have a decent income. Because if you travel to the global south, even the poorest people, they are working. In some sense, they have job. But their job are mostly in traditional agriculture with very low productivity, very low earning, or in some kind of social service, with very little technology, little income for them. And although they are employed, they have job, but they cannot generate decent income. If you want to make people to have a decent income, the goal 9 in SDG is essential. We should have technological innovations in the traditional agriculture to make that into modern agriculture, to raise the productivities so they can have high income. But agriculture alone is not sufficient. If you want to make the people to have a job, industrialization is a necessity. We need to migrate from agriculture to the modern manufacturing, and for that they can have decent income, and with decent income, they can protect themselves. And also, if we can have successful industrialization, structural transformation program, the growth rate in the country will be raised. Government will have more tax revenues. It will be easier for your job, for the domestic resource mobilization. And when the country was hit by some kind of short-term shock, the government will have more resources to stabilize the economy, and the government will have more resources to provide temporary relief to the needed people. So we need to have reprioritization of the social protection programs. To make that happen, international financial institutions can do many things. Because social protection has been a traditional goal of international financial institutions. For example, I was lucky to be the chief economist of the World Bank in 2008. When I entering into the gate of the main office of the World Bank, I saw a slogan: a world free of poverty is our dream. The social protection, right? They have been working on this program for now 80 years, but poverty is almost everywhere in the global south. And under this kind of situation, certainly we need to rethink. Because a lot of the program in the past, in general, are for short-term relief. Hunger, poverty, health. Those kind of short-term relief. And if we want to reprioritize, as I mentioned, job, decent job, need to have new technology, need to have industrialization in the global south. And to do that, I think the international development institution, bilateral development institution, need to switch the focus from short-term relief to this kind of long-term self-protection. To give a fish change to empower the people to be able to fish. For that, as I said, modern technology in agriculture is essential. But in addition to that, on top of that, most importantly, is the industrialization in the global south. And to make that happen, industrial policy is essential. Industrialization will not happen in the world anywhere in the history or in the modern time without active government support. So we need to have industrialization programs or industrial policy to target sectors which the country have competitive advantages and turn that into the competitiveness globally. And for that, the government need to provide incentive to the first movers, entrepreneurs. The government should actively to attract foreign direct investment into sectors which the country have the competitive advantages. And in global south, the competitive advantage in general in the labor-intensive sectors, which can generate huge numbers of jobs and allow people to migrate from agriculture to modern manufacturing. And to make the industrialization to be successful, we also need to improve infrastructure. That's also goal 9. But infrastructure is poor almost everywhere in the global south. And the government do not have sufficient resources to improve the infrastructure for the whole nation. So some kind of pragmatic enclave approach will be essential. That is to set up industrial park, spatial economic zone, within the park and a spatial economic zone to have sufficient good infrastructure, business environment. And certainly, you also need to educate the workers to be employable, but the education need to match the needs of the industrialization. And for those, you need to have new development thinkings. And that, I think, is the most important reform in the international financial institutions. If they can do that, I think every country can jumpstart from stagnation to dynamic economic growth. They can turn into the virtual cycle Dr. Akabe just mentioned in a country. And by that, the crisis in our social protection programs can be an opportunity for a new start. And we can achieve the goal of the SDGs, hopefully if it's not 2030, but at least 2040, we can see a world free of poverty. Thank you.
A big hand for my panelists, please. I would just like to get a quick indication from the session leader. How many minutes do I have for Q&A? 20 at the most? Okay, 20 minutes. So we'll follow a very simple structure. C plus P equals E. Concise and precise equals efficiency. So to the audience, we'll go 3 questions at each go. So please be concise, please be precise, and we'll be able to maximize the 20 minutes that we have. So I already see 1, 2, and 3. So the first mic here, if I could have the first mic in the front, please. The gentleman here, right here.
I'd like to thank all the panelists for very perceptive presentations. It is clear that the international financial architecture needs reform in many domains, and your coverage has been extensive. But I have one question that has troubled me for some time. If we look at the world around us, there are heavily indebted poor countries where external debt alone is more than 50% of GDP, and debt servicing exceeds export earnings. The situation is much worse in some countries. At the same time, governments in these countries owe a large debt to their people, which they're not able to service. So what gets squeezed in the process is resources allocated for social protection everywhere. Now, I think the particularly vulnerable countries are the heavily indebted ones. And there is need for, I think it was mentioned, there is need for an institutional arrangement in the international financial sector that deals with their problems, whether it's debt restructuring, debt cancellation, in an equitable and fair way. The institutions that exist, Paris Club, it was much like, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Shylock. You have the World Bank and IMF running the heavily indebted poor countries HIPC initiative. You have the G20 common framework. But there is nothing yet that provides an equitable restructuring of debt to resolve these countries' problems. And social protection is the casualty. Can the panelists think of merging these, creating a different, these are tired mechanisms, they're not working, something different?
Thank you very much. And while we go to the second one there, that would be the first question would definitely go to Dr. Milia and Professor Lin. Next question, please.
So my question is about comparative advantage. We mentioned industrialization, but we also mentioned agricultural productivity. I think, I'm just being provocative, I think maybe except with South Africa, some high plains of Kenya, I'm not sure most African countries will have a comparative advantage in agriculture. In Brazil, even now is investing in cocoa production, aiming to take over from Ivory Coast. So I wonder, do you see a direction of which areas will be the dynamic areas for growth in African countries? Thank you. Thank you.
As we go to the last question, Lucky Star as well as Prof. Ayebe, that will be the second question for you both. And the last question, yes, for this round.
Thank you, and congratulations for the excellent panel. Thank you for all the interventions. And my question, I will try to touch on relation to the last speaker, mainly in the role of ideologies, because we currently all the things that we have been speaking, and mainly the last panelists, touch base on the structural transformation of the state and the role of the state. But currently we are facing a world in which some countries, mainly one of the most powerful countries in the world, are trying to divert this agenda. So what will be the role of these international conversations and the role of the institutions that we are facing in order to embed these messages of structural changes and the need for this development agenda? Thank you.
Thank you. I think Professor Annette and Professor Lin can answer the last question. But please, Dr. Milia, the first question, as well as Professor Lin, you can chime in.
Many thanks, Professor Nair. I don't know if I have the answer, but you are completely right that there are many countries, as I mentioned before, paying more than the export earnings on debt. And also we have estimated that around 10–30% of the payments go only on servicing. So restructuring is a must in the discussion of the reform of the financial architecture. But one issue is that, I mean, we mentioned the G20 common framework, but we need to see why there is such a slow uptake of developing countries, with only 4 African countries taking part of it. And one issue is clearly the cumbersome procedures. Countries don't have the technical capacity to go through the process in a timely manner. But the other issue is creditors' participation, because we need to have everybody around the table. As long as we don't have a symmetric negotiation with creditors, and this it includes the multilateral international financial institutions and the private sector, we will not reach an equilibrium. So the issue of this asymmetry and not having the creditors on the table is an issue. And this might sound a bit technical, but all lies also on the issue of comparability treatment, which also remains largely unforeseeable. So again, we face asymmetries between North and South here that require more discussions in the G20. UNCTAD has been doing a lot of work on this, and we have seen that there is some modifications proposed, especially having more participation in the G7, of the developing countries in the G7 discussions. And as my predecessor explained, Luke Starr, we have the EU has a seat in the G20, UNCTAD has a seat. Before the UN only had one seat for all the agencies, but still not having clear negotiations with the creditors remains an issue. And then all will fall down to when you reduce the services payments, then you will have more for social protection.
Well, for the debt issue, certainly when a country highly indebted and in a crisis mode, under that kind of situation, some kind of temporary relief would be essential. But more important to this issue is the so-called debt sustainability framework. Because currently, if a country, if they have high debt ratio, they cannot borrow. And as we discussed, if a country wants to turn from stagnation to dynamic economic growth, they need to make some investment to improve infrastructure and so on. So I think that for the debt sustainability program, we need to distinguish the borrowing is to support consumption, or the borrowing is to support investment and allow the country to jumpstart dynamic economic growth. If the borrowing is for the second purpose, even a country it already has a high debt ratio should be allowed to borrow, because that would be needed for the country to have a new growth momentum. And also, those kind of borrowing actually create asset, because if you improve the infrastructure, it's an asset. And if you use that debt to support consumption, certainly that's a real debt. And we need to actually to have some kind of rethinking about this kind of debt sustainability framework that is equally important for what you said, that short-term need to give some kind of temporary relief for the highly indebted country.
Ms. Miandazi for the second question.
Yes, thank you so much. So first, before I answer the questions, just very quickly on debt and institutions. Just recently, the African Union had a conference in Lomé in Togo and there's a declaration, the Lomé Declaration, that has some of these elements, including fronting the idea of something new under the UN on debt. So I would advise you check that out online. On the question that was addressed on comparative advantage for African countries, one of the things that we do have a comparative advantage on is our youthful population, and this has introduced entrepreneurial ideas that like we've never seen before. We need to create jobs for them, and we're seeing this increase. Of course, agriculture still remains one of the biggest, especially in employment of women in the society. Technology also, and innovation, and that's why we're insistent on taxation of the digital economy. What can we gain eventually in Africa on this? The extractive sector, rationalizing some of the tax exemptions that we've been giving for so many years in this extractive sector. Are they really necessary for our governments? Should we continue to give them out? How can we create value in our own continent? So I know that Botswana, for example, has announced now that they will also start processing their own diamonds in Botswana before exporting. So these are some of the innovations that are coming up in African countries. And of course, because of this dire need of the growing youthful population, we need to create employment, we need to provide decent jobs, quality, and they still need to contribute to the economy. I come from Kenya, and we've seen what the Gen Zs can do. So now the youth are showing us that we can actually create a new world where we think beyond just the reliance on agriculture and try to diversify. Thank you so much.
Professor Akebe will close off, but I would like to go to Professor Annette on the same question, if you can expand a little bit more.
The same question looks like we are looking at it from the same angle. Thank you, as tax people. Dynamic areas for growth in Africa. I think this is critical, and it is important for the globe at large with the issues of immigration that we are facing, because what happens in one corner of the world has an impact to the rest of the world. And so coming together as a globe to be sensitive about issues that are happening in the one corner of the bigger room is quite critical. So what are some of the areas that I will re-emphasize what Lucky Star has just said? The service industry is a big one, and she's talked about issues about digitalization in Kenya, beneficiation in the mineral sector. You've referred to Botswana. This is a big thing they are working on, and many African countries are actually putting a lot of emphasis on beneficialization, the matter that you've just raised, going beyond agriculture and increasing industrialization. Industrialization, a big thing, big special economic zones that are being raised in very many African countries. And the concern here, as we get into investing in some of this sector, then as I was talking about international tax issues, now we see issues regarding the global minimum tax and curtailing tax incentives. How can countries in the global south ensure that there is substance in some of the investments that are being encouraged, and to avoid offering tax incentives for that are inefficient, and multinationals or companies would have invested in any case, even without those incentives. Yes, the global south, Africa at large, is being recognized as the new frontier for investment. The minerals are there. We have a big youth. So in terms of labor that is there, that has to be developed to a level that is trustable and efficient in developing some of the developments that are needed to address these issues. But this is a global issue. To address issues in the global north by the south, it's literally all of us in one pond. We fail to acknowledge that there is a ripple that is coming up on the other side, and the wave of it is coming towards my door. I think that's a matter we need to acknowledge and work together to resolve.
And finally, Professor Akebe, to close off this round of questioning.
Thank you very much. I believe the question our colleague presented is quite important. It brings us back to the issue, how can developing countries, be it low and middle income or African countries, increase their growth, become central. The current growth rate is not adequate to ensure there is support for social protection. Africa, if we take as example, in the last 50 years, average GDP growth has been 3.5%. It's above the global 3.1%, but much lower than Asia, which is 5% for the last 50 years. And the central question is, without growth, when the population is growing fast, and I'm a strong believer that the population dynamics is so important to drive growth, because it's about growing market opportunity, it's about productive capacity, it's about creating employment for many. So it's not a curse, it's actually an important asset. So the growth has to be higher. We have seen in some African countries, resource-poor countries, where GDP has been growing quite fast. 10.5% for 15 years has been Ethiopia's record in GDP growth. And the second point is, what is necessary is not the growth of the economy, but also improving the quality of the economy, or in other way, structural transformation. We have all been researching on this area for the last at least 2 decades. Many of the colleagues here, Deepak, Justin, and UNU-WIDER, has been doing extensive support. And a critical issue is we need to look at strategic priority in every local context, national context. We need to apply an industrial policy perspective and framework to draw higher quality of growth. And here becomes manufacturing becomes central because of the spillover effect. Agriculture is critical. When we talk agriculture, it's a wide sector. Employment will be limited, but the production will be important. Many African countries still import food. And securing food security will take a lot in terms of reducing inflation, in terms of also improving livelihood in urban centers. Same thing with some services. Mm-hmm. And we also see some important progress made in many of African countries. So this brings us back to the, for me, a unifying factor that for social protection to succeed, even if we reform international system, which is doubtful, although we will have to continue putting pressure, but what is in our control primarily is to drive growth, to drive economic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just take two final very quick questions. We'll go gender balance at the end and over here. So right next to you, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's just so interesting to hear all your views, and it makes me question that if we really want to reform the international financial architecture, it's actually more political than the need for global cooperation. That's how I'm seeing it. So I'm wondering, what is your view then? Like, for example, we have the social contract, which really founds the responsibility between state and society. But if we're talking about social protection and we want to bring in the global tax system as well to be responsible to provide the social protection, should we not also consider expanding the social contract to make it more tripartite, so that not only do we have the state and society, but also multinational corporations, because they are very much responsible for creating this entire spider's web of BEPS going around. So just your views on the same. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last question up in the front here. Lucky Star, that would be your question.
Thanks a lot. This is Veronika Wozak again from the International Labour Organization. Just a quick comment, we heard this yesterday as well about the focus on employment and job generation for improving social protection, and our employers' organizations always say that the best social protection is a decent job. I think it's important to maintain some conceptual clarity in this discussion. I fully agree that job-led growth is very important and that it needs to be a decent job. If your job is exploitative and makes you ill, if the wage regime is not such that it increases your contributory capacity also for social security and also generates tax revenues that enables the government to invest, that all is super important, but that's not social protection. The promise of the government to support you in finding a decent job is important, but it's different from the government to support your income security and access to healthcare regardless of your employment status. And also, we must not forget that a large part of the population we do not want to see on the labor market, and social protection systems should cater towards those populations. We don't want child labor. We don't want women, when they are pregnant, to work around childbirth. We don't want elderly to have to work until they drop dead. And that is a different promise from job generation. So that's one part. And the other comment I wanted to make is that I think it's important to link the excellent panel we had yesterday as the last session with this one. I think the point that was made there, that in a lot of countries we see a downward spiral between lack in trust in governments, unwillingness to pay taxes, lower tax revenues, less ability to invest in public services, and like a downward development spiral. And that the important role of international financial institutions to come in to kickstart an upward spiral whereby governments can invest again and generate trust again and willingness to pay taxes. It's not just about enforcing tax regimes, it's also about proving as a government that people can trust and want to pay taxes, right? I mean, if we link this to today's discussion, we heard a lot about investment in infrastructure, which is clearly important. But maybe it's not sufficient to buy that, to regenerate that trust, because until the economic growth kicks in, that may take a longer term. So this question of what do we see as a role for the international financial institutions and ODA to also rebuild public institutions that are more accountable and stronger? And so, yeah, linking yesterday's panel and today's panel, I think, would be important.
Thank you. Professor Lin, you'll end with that comment as we close this session. But firstly, Lucky Star.
So I agree and disagree with Professor Leila. So Dr. Leila, you talked about the political reform of the IFA. So I completely agree that one thing that both with the UN and with AU that I've learned is that you do need the policymakers in the room. You need them on the table because eventually they need to understand what BEPS mean. They need to understand what transfer pricing mean. They need to understand the implications of this. So I agree with you in that regard. On the tripartite idea that you have, I wouldn't call it a social contract myself. I would agree that multinational corporations should also have some level of accountability to countries. But of course, if you go to MNCs, they will tell you we already have CSR. And that this accounts for, in their opinion, as their way of giving back to the society. So I would say that right now, given the amounts of money that are lost from cross-border interactions, I think we do need to discuss with multinational corporations about better standards, link it to the human value of the work that they do at the national level. But I think starting from a tax perspective of them paying what they need in the countries where they actually extract value and they actually extract. I think that's my first stage before I move on to social contract with them. And I think the last point that was made actually emphasizes this, which came also from the panel from yesterday. First, we need to strengthen the social contract between the government and their citizens. And I think with that, then the governments will be able, when they're negotiating with multinational corporations coming into their country, negotiate better for their citizens, negotiate better terms for the multinationals to operate in their country. So I think the contract there between the government and the multinational is what I would emphasize, and then that links to what they do to the citizens within the country, and then we can think about eventually making that at the international level. Thank you.
Okay.
Very quickly to connect on the issue of how to bring this third leg to the table. We tend to forget that there is companies come to a country either directly or through investment treaties. Just to give you a number, out of 3,000 international investment agreements out there, only 6 have gender provisions that are enforceable. The others are aspirational. And then when it comes to sustainable development, many of the state investors' dispute settlements happen because sustainable development issues. So as long as developing countries don't come to the equal footing on the table with multinational enterprises, all the issues related to social protection and environment will be on the unequal side. And the other issue is on the utilization of outward investment promotion as a tool for development. I have done some work on gender, and it's not only the investment that they bring, but also the social norms and practice. And believe me, there are not more than 2-3 countries, one of them is the Netherlands, that provide investment promotion outward incentives to the companies from their country to behave socially responsible where they invest. So this is an issue that is not very much touched upon development, but is important. Finally, is you mentioned reporting CSR, ESG, but there is a lot of greenwashing and social washing, so we cannot take the reporting of multinationals as an indicator. Because, for example, again, on gender, we only get gender indicators at the board level. We don't get middle level, we don't get lower level employees. So these issues, there is a lot of, with the UN Compact, a lot of makeup and sugarcoating, but in the reality is that we need to improve and we need to have more open conversation, and there is more room for investment policy in this discussion.
Well, I'd like to come back to the issue of politics. If you want to change the agenda of international development financial institutions, certainly it will be a result of political equilibrium by the stakeholder countries. But we know politics in any countries is shaped by public opinions. And so fundamentally, we need to change the public opinions in the stakeholder countries. But how to change the public opinions? Evidence-based research carried out by important research institutions like UN-WIDER and other credible academic institutions would be important. And to have conference like this to make those kind of research funding understandable and also can be shared by the public would be essential. And fundamentally, I think all the people have goodwill. They like to have a better society in their country. They also like to have a better world for the humanities. And so we can look back what we did, and although we have good intention, but we did not achieve the goal. Now, with new evidence, based on research, I think we should have confidence on humanity because we all want to have a better world.
Thank you very much. And I would like to close finally with this from my side. My takeaways from yesterday and this morning is this. By learning from foundations laid in the past to growth that give us action points to respect and build equity with equality today, it will result in innovative approaches to growth and equity tomorrow. So if we are to safeguard tomorrow, we have to understand yesterday and maximize today. My name is Nazir Pando, and I am honored to have been invited by UNU-WIDER to moderate this session. Thank you to the panelists. May you all have a good day.